Hey guys, I'm here with Aidan Muir from Ideal Nutrition. Aidan is a registered dietitian in Brisbane, Australia, and today just wanted to ask him about nutrition and what you should eat, how to have a healthy diet. So, Aidan, do you mind just quickly introducing yourself, giving a brief background of your academic history?
So, brief background, I have a university degree in nutrition and dietetics, so 4-year degree. Studied in Charles Sturt University in Wagga Wagga, which is like a small country town, and now I live in Brisbane.
Great. And you're practicing as a dietitian. Who do you tend to treat? Is it generally athletes or general pop or people with specific diseases?
So I see all of the above. I like working with athletes. I work with a lot of athletes. I do a lot of general population, like weight loss type stuff, and then also chronic diseases, irritable bowel syndrome. I see a fair bit. Something that's changed a bit over the years is like earlier in my career, I was seeing a lot more complex clients. And since I get a lot of my clients through Instagram now, most people seem to be the ages like 20 to 40, and a lot of them are kind of simple, not major like heaps of medical conditions going on. Usually I have like one or two medical conditions, whereas early on I felt like once you get over the age of like 60, there's a lot going on.
Great. And my audience is probably predominantly interested in calisthenics or fitness. You have a background, you've competed in powerlifting, haven't you?
I have, yeah, I've been doing that for a while now, yeah.
You're not just your average Joe dietitian, you're also kind of in the field of strength sports.
Yeah, for sure.
Fantastic. All right. So to start with, the reason I got you on is because you are a registered dietitian. And in this day and age, a lot of people seem to call themselves nutritionists online. And my understanding is that nutritionist is not a protected term in Australia. So that means I can call myself a nutritionist, anybody can call themselves a nutritionist and give advice, but it's illegal to call yourself a dietitian unless you have a degree and are registered as a dietitian. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's to my understanding. Like I don't know what the repercussions are if somebody does call themselves a dietitian, but my understanding is it is a protected term and you can't use it without the qualification.
Great. So if you're after somebody with true credentials in nutrition, it's probably best to see a dietitian, at least if you're in Australia, rather than just somebody calling themselves a nutritionist.
Yeah, I think so. I have mixed views. I don't know if you share the exact same opinion, but I think there can be good people in every profession, and there's incredible practitioners who are not dietitians. But I do think if you're seeking out a dietitian, the bar is kind of raised because it's like, well, at least you know at a minimum they've done 4 years of study for this. So the odds of finding a bad practitioner are probably lower.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think facts speak for themselves, and it doesn't really matter who's saying them.
Mm,
But your average dietitian has a lot more knowledge than your average Joe from the street when it comes to the field of nutrition and what you should eat.
yeah.
So to start with, could you just help explain how your diet can positively or negatively affect your health? So why should we care about what we eat?
Yeah, it's broad because it can affect everything. Like it can affect, if we're talking positive, like we can talk about stuff like body composition. It can help your sleep. It can help immune function, mental health, fueling how you perform and how you even feel in the gym or just training in general. Affects your digestion, hormones, energy levels, like endless lists. And I think it's also interesting when you go to that negative side because I'm going to go extremely simple here and just hone in on like one thing. But say you eat way too many calories or way too few calories in either direction. I know I'm only talking calories, but if you go extreme in either direction, causes issues. Like if you go extremely high, obesity develops over time. We know that's linked with a bunch of chronic diseases and everything. If you go way too low, malnutrition is a risk too. So like it's linked with everything. Like it makes sense to have like at least an appropriate intake or at least somewhere in the ballpark.
So the things that I think of when it comes to positively affecting your health are things like not being malnourished, eating adequate
Yeah.
protein to help with body composition, so more muscle mass, less fat mass, and eating in accordance with your energy needs so you don't develop obesity or starve to death. Would you say that there is such thing as a best diet?
So the blanket answer is no for me. Um, there are some diets that people will link more positively with health outcomes. Like for example, the Mediterranean diet. Like you'll rarely hear people speak negatively of the Mediterranean diet. But even then, I'm like, well, there's downsides for certain people. Like if I was working with an athlete, I'm going to be giving them higher protein than the Mediterranean diet traditionally had. Like in all of these cases, um, I think there's individualization based on people's goals. And then you could be like, well, is there a best diet for somebody with very specific goals? But even then, like we know there are so many benefits from a variety perspective. So even if we could narrow down to like, this is theoretically the best diet, we know there are benefits from a variety from like, we could look at it from a gut health perspective. We could look at it from a, like different antioxidants, polyphenols, and all of these things. So it starts getting quite broad, which is why I'd say there's no best diet, even though once again, there's kind of a range of what would be a very good diet for people.
I think a lot of people online really like very clear approaches and scientific approaches. So when people say, this is the best food you should eat, here is the one nutrient that is most important, people really cling on to that. But just like exercise, do you think it's more of a principles-based approach rather than a recipe-based approach where there is a one-size-fits-all best thing to do?
Yeah, very much so. It's very principles based. And I've obviously, just like you, I've been on social media for a very long time now, but over the last year, I've spent more time like studying video content because it just wasn't something that came naturally to me. And I'm in a certain group full of people who have really blown up on social media over the last 2 years. And it's so interesting just being like the things that are working for them in many cases are leading towards that like recipe based approach about like how simple can we make this. And there's so many times where I'm like, I think they've gone too simple with this. Like I think they've gone way too recipe based approach when it is principles overall, which is it's a murky area about being like sometimes you got to do certain things to communicate really clearly, but it's like you should never like simplify it to the point that it's actively detrimental to the people you're speaking to as well.
Yeah, I fully agree. It's really hard to convey nuance in short form social media content. And unfortunately, the incentives aren't really aligned with balanced content. So the things that tend to go off are really polarizing, firm, assertive claims. And often we need to have a little bit more humility and we don't actually know the answers, like this is the best food or this is the best exercise. I see a lot of parallels between nutrition and exercise. So we know that exercise is important. We know that exercise can have health benefits, but we don't know what the best exercise is. So
Yeah.
there's no best sport you should play. You can't really make the claim that cycling is better than running. It might have certain things that it is better for, but when you're just looking at general health outcomes, it's kind of very flexible principles like do cardio, do resistance training.
Yeah.
And I think you see similar things when it comes to nutrition. So a lot of people will know about macronutrients and will have heard this term if it fits your macros. Could you just give a brief outline of what macronutrients are and what this if it fits your macros diet is?
So macronutrients are what we'd call larger nutrients. That's in the name, macronutrients. Micronutrients are smaller nutrients, but macronutrients are protein, fats, and carbs. And if we wanted to extend that, we could say alcohol is technically a macronutrient as well. So they are nutrients that are containing calories. Protein has 4, carbs have 4 calories per gram, and fat has 9 calories per gram. So that's what macronutrients are. With if it fits your macros, if it fits your macros is simply the concept of if you hit certain macronutrient numbers, it doesn't really matter how you get there in terms of the impact on body composition. And if we were just going to analyze that claim in isolation, technically that is relatively true from what we'd see. We can dive deeper on like pros, cons, et cetera, but in terms of simply looking at body composition outcomes, outside of extremes, that is a relatively true claim.
Right. Would you say there's a hierarchy of importance for macronutrients? A claim that you'll often hear online is protein should be prioritized, and then
Mhm.
as long as you're kind of eating a normal diet, you're probably getting enough fats and carbs in there, and it doesn't really matter how you balance those.
I think from a purely body composition perspective, under most circumstances, that is surprisingly true. Like the deeper down the rabbit hole you go, the more you're like, oh, if you do consume a sufficient amount of protein, we could talk about specifics of that, but like a sufficient amount of protein, and you compare lower carb versus lower fat approaches, people seem to be getting similar body composition outcomes. There is a little gap that I think is often overlooked in that most of this research is done under the circumstances of a calorie deficit. And if we do put these large groups of people into a calorie deficit, half of them get low carb, half of them get low fat, and they get similar outcomes. A lot of people have kind of made the interpretation that the same would occur in a surplus, I think it's a little bit more skeptical about that. And we do see even in the bodybuilding world, a lot of people do lower fat approaches, far higher carb approaches. And there is logic around that about being like, well, if you have higher carbs, you'll have more glycogen, that'll help your training, so on and so forth. And we also know that technically, if you just like followed carbohydrates in your body, they're far less likely to get stored as body fat than actual dietary fat. So there is a little bit of like logic there. But if I was just going to say like blanket statement, is that like just hit your protein and let the other stuff fall wherever, and it's likely to come out similarly for body composition, I would say that's more true than false in a way.
And if you had to give a recommendation of how much protein we should be consuming, could you give us two recommendations? One for general population who is relatively sedentary, and then one who is for most of the people I assume would be listening to this, who are involved in strength sports or who are athletes.
Yeah, awesome. Let's start with the athletes one and we'll work backwards from there. So the general standard recommended range that I give and aligns with the consensus of like the evidence-based community is 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Just to convert to make that easier for people listening, if somebody's 100 kilos, it's 160 grams to 220 grams. Do you work in pounds? Is pounds easier?
Depends where I am in the world, but yeah, in the US,
let's call it like 1 gram per pound of body weight. Like that's a nice round figure, right?
Which is just the upper end of that recommendation when converted.
Spot on. It's the upper end of the recommendation, which therefore should make you think like, where does this recommendation come from? And I also think this is an underappreciated kind of area of the nutrition world in terms of a lot of people just hear that range and don't really think a little bit deeper than that. Firstly, it comes from people with a bias towards absolutely maximizing muscle growth. And that's cool because I share that bias. Like I would rather absolutely maximize it than not absolutely maximize it. But this is also why we see some other people recommending slightly lower ranges. For example, in Australia, we have the AIS and when the Australian Institute of Sport, and when I last checked, their range was 1.4 to 2.0 rather than 1.6 to 2.2. Why can they say that? Because 1.4 is almost the same as 1.6. Like it's almost as good, right? But when people look at the research with the lens of absolutely maximizing muscle growth, 1.6 to 2.2 is the range. But if you dig deeper, it seems like most people kind of max out at 1.6 grams per kilo. The way that 2.2 number kind of came around was just a statistical technique. It was just a confidence interval. It was just the logic that this maximizes it for almost all people, but outliers exist. Let's put a number that's higher to cover outliers. And I think that's really interesting to think about because if I just say to somebody listening to this, the range is 1.6 to 2.2, I think most people would be like, well, I want to maximize stuff, so I'm going to have 2.2 rather than 1.6. Whereas I just worded it the way I just worded it, and you're like, well, 1.6 actually probably maximizes it for you. And then the next step of the research is like, who is the research mostly done on? It's mostly done on relatively lean males, just recreational lifters. Like I'm going to estimate most of them are not that far above 15% body fat in these studies. So most of them are relatively lean, and a lot of them would be even potentially closer to the 10% body fat mark. We know that protein needs are technically linked more to how much muscle mass we have than our total body weight. And I just say total body weight to kind of keep it simpler. But that therefore means if somebody had quite a high body fat percentage, they technically require less protein per gram or per kilo of body weight, which therefore means in many cases, you could even go slightly lower than that range to optimize stuff. But that's the general range. The reason why I've gone so deep on that is because then it also adds context on what should just the general person who wants to be relatively healthy want to do. This is actually a really hard question to answer. Like if I was just going to say, I have a bias towards say 1.2 grams per kilo or higher, I would just reduce the range a little bit. But if we look around the world, there are many populations that live long and healthy lives that have substantially lower protein intakes than that. And one of the biggest arguments that I've seen for that is, although we have a lot of research showing that as people age, they should probably increase their protein intake a little bit to help with muscle retention and falls prevention, and a few of these other things. There's a lot of benefits associated with it. Simply just being active gets you a lot of those benefits as well. And somebody could, quote unquote, get away with a slightly lower protein intake if they're active, because all of those benefits we're looking at, they will maintain muscle slightly easier if they're more active. They'll maintain bone mineral density, maintain balance, so on and so forth. So it's a hard question to answer what is like ideal for general population because it is such a big range. Even though if I'm going to give a number, I'm going to say 1.2 grams per kilo. You can see why it's so broad.
Great. So just to summarize that, 1.2 grams per kilogram for kind of general population. And for those trying to maximize muscle mass and improve body composition, 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram.
Yeah, that's what I'd go with. Yeah.
Fantastic. When it comes to if it fits your macros, a lot of people in the bodybuilding space follow this. Okay, I want to get 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. They find a rough estimate of how many calories they need, and they divide the remaining calories between fats and carbs. And this seems to be great for body composition. But if it fits your macros is missing a few things. Could you talk about some of the downsides of if it fits your macros and what we're missing out on?
Yeah. So if I was going to jump straight to stuff that matters, I'm going to say micronutrients and fiber intake. And you can get around that. Some bodybuilders do simply by also tracking their fiber intake. So it's like, well, that kind of gets around that problem. The micronutrient stuff is interesting in terms of if we look at a lot of things in relation to performance and recovery, there are so many micronutrients linked to that. And I'm going to use a little example here, magnesium intake. If we look at dietary magnesium intake and sleep quality and quantity, people who have higher intakes of magnesium typically get better sleep. You can poke holes in that and be kind of like, well, is that actually the magnesium, or is there other behaviors they're doing? Are they having higher intakes of other things, so on and so forth? But the higher intakes of other things still is like, well, they're getting more micronutrients in general. That seems to be leading to better sleep. And there's also a theoretical mechanism as to why it helps with sleep as well. That's one simple angle. But I'm like, if people get better sleep, are they going to be recovering better? Are they going to be training better? Are they going to be improving their body composition due to this stuff? We have enough evidence to be like, this clearly can't matter that much, because otherwise, if it fits your macros, would completely fall apart in the research.
Yep.
But I do think when you're trying to like get the best performance overall, this stuff matters. Jumping onto like a few things that probably matter a little bit less and are probably a little bit less relevant for bodybuilders, but if it fits your macros, probably encourages a lack of variety with intake, because say you're using MyFitnessPal, you can scan barcodes now. It's really cool in 2024. Like it, technology is great, but that encourages you to eat packaged foods rather than like say you're going to make a salad with 5+ different vegetables. That's so much harder to track than just like scanning a barcode. So, and you can also like save your meals and just like keep eating the same things over and over. So it encourages a lack of variety, which is potentially an issue from an overall health perspective. But the other thing that's far less relevant for bodybuilders is sometimes people just keep running into the same issues over and over and over. And you can get around those by using other approaches. The example I mean here is like, say somebody keeps getting really hungry in the afternoon and they keep unintentionally snacking and going over their calories. Like this is something that happens pretty commonly. And they're trying to follow an if it fits your macro style approach. That potentially could have been resolved with other approaches that might be more satiating. So that's another thing that I'd contemplate as well.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that the general public has with micronutrients, we know things that like especially fiber is linked with good health outcomes. People who eat more fiber tend to have better health outcomes. And we know that micronutrients are important. So for example, if you don't have enough vitamin C, you get scurvy and your teeth fall out. That's obviously not great for you. But I think in Australia, in the USA, and in most Western countries, people are kind of getting a minimum requirement of micronutrients to not have any drastically adverse health outcomes. But one issue I see with trying to give nutrition advice to the general public is that macronutrients are relatively simple. You've got fats, carbs, protein. You can kind of encourage people to minimize alcohol as much as possible. But when it comes to micronutrients, there are so many. You have B vitamins, C vitamins, magnesium, selenium, potassium, calcium. And it's so hard to track all of those and to know how much you should get. So if you could give some general tips, what should I do to make sure I'm getting enough micronutrients and fiber in my diet?
So I wouldn't necessarily do this step, but this is one thing that you actually can do. So there's chronometer. I think that's how you say it, chronometer or chronometer. It's like MyFitnessPal, but it tracks micronutrients alongside it. That is a common one people do that actually like identify individual gaps. But if I was going to go beyond that, I would say, and this might seem a bit boring, but like 5 core food groups. I would consider just like starting with the 5 core food groups and having a sufficient amount of those things, like eating a decent amount of lean protein sources, eating a decent amount of high fiber, whole grain options, fruits, vegetables, and then dairy alternatives. And if I went deeper with a bunch of that stuff, I could respond to any criticisms of that. Like if somebody's like, oh, I don't want to have dairy, I'd be like, okay, let's do calcium fortified dairy alternatives. Like I could go through all those things. But if you have a wide variety of mostly what you would consider nutritious foods, and you're consuming sufficient calories, and you have a relatively low intake of added sugar and things that are not containing micronutrients, the odds of you getting a good micronutrient intake overall typically works out pretty high. And I say that as somebody who has literally like tracked the micronutrient intake of like heaps and heaps and heaps of people. I'm like, oh, every time I see somebody with like what looks like a solid overall diet, they're ticking almost every single box. Every time I see somebody with what looks like a poor overall diet, they're usually having these massive gaps as well.
Yeah. I think a few principles that I follow to just try to make sure I get enough micronutrients and fiber are to just eat plenty of plant foods and try to eat a wide variety of them.
Yeah.
I think if you just follow these kind of general principles of like minimizing ultra processed foods, going for whole foods where possible, you kind of lean in that direction anyway. You're going to be eating more nutrient dense foods. You'll be eating more plants, and that should ensure you're getting enough micronutrients and fiber.
Yeah, and even doubling down on that, in that there's one thing that I've started communicating so much more over the last like 1 or 2 years, where I say, general guideline, I really recommend having greater than 80% of intake coming from whole, minimally processed, nutrient-rich foods. And that also leaves a small amount of flexibility to do kind of whatever you want. So it's like you can be flexible and do these things, and it's probably ticking both of those boxes. And that is coming back to that kind of complexity of social media, just being like, if I just put that message out there, it's not going to get that much engagement. There's other things I do that will get more engagement, but I'm like, but that is actually my core message. So I'm like, I've got to put that out there as well.
Yeah. On this note of if it fits your macros, a common bodybuilding diet you'll see is chicken, broccoli, and rice, and kind of eating
Yeah.
that every meal. Chicken, broccoli, and rice are all very nutritious foods, and I think most dietitians would agree. But I don't think that's a very healthy diet if you're kind of eating chicken, broccoli, and rice for every meal. Could you explain what I'd be missing there if I kind of take this bodybuilder approach?
Yeah. Let's take that extreme and be like, that's all you do. There will be micronutrient gaps, like the simplest one, and most bodybuilders will address this, obviously, but I'm taking this extreme. Vitamin A, we're largely finding vitamin A in orange vegetables. You could obviously extend that and be like, you can find it in liver and a few other things, but say you did that, you're missing that. And I'm using just one example. You could extend that and be like, you're low in calcium and like a bunch of other micronutrients. So one, the lack of variety inherently typically means you're going to be low in certain micronutrients. Um, you aren't exposed to a bunch of different plant-based sources which are linked with positive gut health. So it's overly simplistic, but I like simple messages to a degree. Aiming for greater than 30 different plant-based foods per week is typically associated with good gut health. Having less than 10 is typically associated with poor gut health. If you just did chicken, broccoli, rice, let's call rice a plant food. So like you've got two there, you've got broccoli and rice. That's two, it's just not getting it done. And then we've obviously got the lack of flexibility with food as well. Just being like, although the stuff with if it fits your macros, it can be absolutely abused. Using a little bit of common sense, it's like you can get exactly the same results by subbing out, say, one of those chicken, broccoli, and rice meals for something else. Like you can have a bit more flexibility. And I could go on for days and days, but like even like you start looking at like omega-3 intake and like that's quite low, and we know that's linked to positive health benefits. So this is part of why I do preach a bit of variety for like there's so many reasons for it.
Yeah, just to take an extreme to show why if it fits your macros isn't great. If you're getting the exact same macronutrients, you're getting plenty of protein and you're distributing the rest between fats and carbs. But in one diet, you're eating lean meats and a large variety of plants. And in the other diet, you're just eating protein bars and predominantly saturated rather than polyunsaturated fats. Your health outcomes over a very long term will likely be very different.
Yeah, very, very likely.
Yeah. When it comes to building muscle, I think most of the people listening to this are worried about performance and body composition. And there is a difference between weight loss and fat loss. So when it comes to losing weight, I think most people understand that if you're in a calorie deficit over a long enough time, you should lose weight. However, if I want to maximize fat loss and minimize muscle loss, what principles should I follow to achieve that?
So at minimum, starting with high enough protein intake. I know it's boring, but like I think that I didn't touch on earlier to keep it simpler, but technically protein needs are slightly higher in the deficit. And that sounds a bit counterintuitive. Sometimes people are like, oh, well, I'm trying to gain muscle, so I eat more protein. When I'm in a fat loss phase, I'll eat less. But it's partly to do with the fact that carbs and protein overlap on some functions. So sometimes people call carbs like protein sparing in a way because they do overlap on some functions. So protein, even a tiny bit higher than what I've recommended previously, makes sense. We are very fortunate that we actually have a pretty wide range of what I would consider an appropriate calorie deficit. So a lot of people say that slow and steady makes the most sense for maintaining muscle. And if I had to agree or disagree with that statement, I would agree, but I want to add one more layer of nuance. There is a lot of research comparing slower versus faster rates. And the one that I think is the most commonly pointed to by people saying that you lose more muscle if you go quicker, compared 0.7% weight loss per week compared to 1.4%. And 1.4% is super aggressive. Like, let's go back to just putting actual numbers on that. If someone's 100 kilos, let's say going down to 99 kilos is 1%. This is talking about like losing more than 1 kilo per week. So the group that lost at 0.7% actually built a tiny bit of muscle over around a 8 week period, 8.5 weeks, I think it was. Firstly, I point that out because a lot of people are like, oh, you're going to a deficit and you're just trying to maintain muscle. I'm like, these people lost at 0.7% per week and they built a bit of muscle. The 1.4%, so quite aggressive, they just maintained their muscle over a 5.5 week period. So I point to that from a few angles. One, you can obviously still build muscle in a deficit. Obviously, the closer you get to your best potential physique, the less likely that is. And the further you get away from optimal, like enough protein, appropriate calories, micronutrient intake, good sleep, et cetera, good training, the harder it is to achieve that. But the other one that I like to come back to is like, if you go slightly quicker, you end the deficit or fat loss phase slightly quicker and can spend the rest of the time at maintenance or in a surplus building muscle. And that's the bit that I'm getting to. And I've only used one study there, but I've kind of made the point that like, there's a wide range of acceptable calorie intake. You can go more aggressive or a little bit less aggressive. Because if you did happen to go a tiny bit more aggressive, you can spend more time at the end building muscle and it likely balances out towards the end. I don't think people appreciate how wide that range is. So summarizing like most important things for fat loss: one, protein intake; two, appropriate calorie intake. Like don't go super low calorie, but there is a pretty wide range. Three, decent micronutrient intake to ensure like good recovery and everything like that. And four, obviously having a good like training stimulus and good sleep as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think a lot of people focus on one thing, you just focus solely on nutrition. But if I'm in a calorie deficit, I'm eating plenty of protein and I'm completely sedentary, I'm still going to
Yeah.
lose a ton of muscle
Yeah.
mass. And to make that point, you can just look at anybody who's immobilized a limb.
Yeah.
After an injury, you put your arm in a cast and you just lose all your muscle.
Mm.
And the rest of your body does not lose muscle as quickly. And resistance training is such a potent stimulus for maintaining and for building muscle mass that it is very important to do if you're trying to maintain muscle while you're in a deficit or while you're trying to lose fat. So it goes to show you that nutrition and exercise definitely complement each other. And on that note, I'm glad you mentioned sleep as well, because there's plenty of short-term research showing that if you equate diets and you just deprive some people of sleep and allow others to sleep more, you tend to see better body composition in those who sleep longer. And that might even extend into positive effects of sleep extension. So if you can get an extra hour of sleep, you might see some benefits from that as well.
Yeah, 100%. Like I haven't gone deep on that research. I've done like very surface level stuff, but like some of these studies, like it's insane how much difference there is on a body composition level. And the only reason I highlight like I haven't gone deep on it is I reckon for all of the studies you find that find this massive difference, I reckon there's a few out there that find like kind of minimal difference, and the answer's somewhere in between. Like the example I'm using is there was a study that I literally saw yesterday where the people that got like sleep restriction by just 1 hour, like 83% of their loss came from lean mass. And then the people who didn't have sleep restriction, it was just like the reverse ratio where it's like they barely lost lean mass. And I'm like, I think that's a bit like, that's too good to be like, that's too big of a difference. But sleep clearly matters. Like it clearly
Yeah,
does.
it's really hard to look at one variable in isolation there, because I believe
Mm.
there's some research showing if you are deprived of sleep, you will tend to lose more muscle mass. But if you kind of supplement that with a training stimulus, that can balance it out. And if you're, participating in resistance training, you might be able to kind of mitigate muscle loss or potentially even build some muscle. But I think the other option of sleeping more is almost always going to be better. And there are other things there that complement each other as well. Like when you're sleep deprived, you tend to be less satiated and tend to eat more.
Yeah.
So it's going to make it harder to achieve your goal of weight loss.
Yeah, I want to even go deeper on that because we clearly see changes with appetite and desire to eat, certain cravings for certain foods. Like people tend to have a preference for higher carb, higher fat combo type of foods, and they're awake for longer, so they have more of a window in which they can eat food. So that's another factor. They're probably more lethargic, less likely to move and everything. And I do you know who Eric Trexler is?
I do,
I
yeah.
heard of him.
From
Yeah,
mass.
he's
Yeah.
said something funny on like the deepest podcast about sleep. He was like going through all the science, and he's like, you know what? When I'm sleep deprived, I just care about my goals less.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
that's perfect.
Was
Like
that,
that's so good.
was that the Stronger by Science podcast?
Yeah, that was like
That
way
was the
back.
same
Yeah.
one. That was fantastic. You mentioned then about this window of eating. So you're awake for longer, you have a larger window. And one of the most popular diets of this age is intermittent fasting. What you see in the research is time restricted feeding. Could you explain what it is and how it works?
So basically, it is just restricting your eating window. The most common form of intermittent fasting that we see is the 16-8 diet, which is where you fast for 16 hours a day and you eat for 8 hours of the day. For example, you might have an eating window of 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. That's the most common one. Intermittent fasting also extends to a lot of other forms. For example, technically, like the 5-2 diet would be intermittent fasting, where you have 2 days of the week where you do a semi fast and then 5 days a week where you eat normally. There's many variations of it, but let's talk about 16-8 because that's the most common one. It just restricts the eating window. That is largely it. You're more likely to eat less calories. People talk about other potential benefits of it, like that.
Just to cut you off there, you're talking about 16 hours in which you fast and 8 hours in which you are allowed to eat. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So let's say 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. Let's go with that. People talk about other potential benefits, and it really seems like when calories are matched or total intake is matched, these things come out the same. Even, for example, autophagy is the most common one that people point to, which is theoretically going to reduce the risk of cancer. It's one of the most common ones people point to. If calories are matched over the entire month, for example, it very, very, very likely balances out. But even though everything I've said there kind of seems like I'm downplaying intermittent fasting, if you look at every randomized control trial out there that has been done on intermittent fasting, almost every single one has resulted in people losing weight for the duration that the study has gone for. And that is not something that can be said about a lot of other dietary approaches, which therefore, like it really shouldn't be ignored. That's like if we compress our eating window, we're likely to eat fewer calories. And I'm not really a proponent, oh, I'm not a proponent of intermittent fasting, but I'm going to chuck something out there about being like, if you found me a large group of people eating greater than 14 hours per day, I reckon you would also be finding me a large group of people who are far more likely than average to be in a calorie surplus as well. Because if you're eating in that large eating window, the likelihood of you eating more calories is substantially higher.
Yeah, I really like what you said there because I've heard a lot of people make claims about intermittent fasting and it's the best thing since sliced bread, and they use mechanistic arguments about hormones and autophagy and whatever mechanism they want to mention. But when you just equate calories, it doesn't seem to outperform any other diet. However, that doesn't mean that it's useless. So it's still a viable strategy for weight loss. And many people find that a really pleasant way to be in a calorie deficit. So certainly one option available to you. And on that note, you see a lot of diets, intermittent fasting, keto, carnivore, vegan, low fat diets, low carb diets. Is there such thing as a best diet, or do they just work through the same principles?
From a fat loss perspective, yeah, they're all working through the same principles. They will all have mechanistic logic, like people in the ketogenic and potentially carnivore community as well will be like pointing to insulin and stuff like that. But in all circumstances, it does still just come back to consuming fewer calories. And in many cases on any of those individual diets that you kind of pointed to, you're so very likely to get full or bored of eating before you consume too many calories. Like example, let's use carnivore diet as an example. You're a lot less likely to want to eat more calories on that versus if you did have that sugar fat combo readily available to you that is so
If,
much easier to
if
overconsume.
if you want to make that point, just get somebody to try and eat 3,000 calories of meat versus 3,000 calories of cheesecake. And it is,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a very different. It's very different.
Do you think there are any unique health benefits to intermittent fasting? Do you think that any of these mechanisms, there's science to kind of confirm them, or at this stage, is that all speculative?
No, I'm even leaning heavily to it being not even speculative at this stage, just being like it's just not
Confirmed it's not
really
being
there. Yeah. So like I was open-minded about the autophagy stuff, about being like I was open-minded from two perspectives about being like, one, how do we actually even measure this? Like how are we doing this over a long period of time? It's a lot easier to measure when you're intermittent fasting because it's all compressed, so we can measure this like big spike or whatever. How do we measure it over the course of a month and see it balance out when it's not having that quick spike or anything like that? Um, and then two, just being like, there's a possibility I don't know everything. Like I've obviously done this for a very, very long time, try to learn as much as I can, but I'm open-minded, right? But it does seem like as more and more and more research comes out, there just aren't unique benefits to intermittent fasting in particular versus spreading it out. I do have one quick caveat that I will chuck on that though. It does seem like every other animal it does seem like every other animal, when you study eating windows and you compare quite a large eating window to a much smaller eating window with calories matched, and you look at longevity in pretty much every other animal, noting that we're obviously going to be doing this on animals with shorter lifespans because it's easier to study, it does seem to extend their lifespan. And I have seen nothing in humans to make me believe that to be true in humans. And humans are very complex and there's a lot going on. But I also do stay a little bit open-minded about that fact. I'm like, well, it seems coincidental that in pretty much every other animal we're seeing this one thing. Maybe there's a chance that this is applicable in some way, shape, or form, which then extends to me about thinking if I was looking at it in my own life, eating window is probably one of the lowest priorities in terms of the things I care about from a nutrition perspective. But I also wouldn't take it to an extreme. Like if I had a circumstance where I could eat 16 hours in a day versus 12 hours in a day, and in both things, I'd be equally happy, it would be equally good for my performance, I'd feel as good, so on and so forth. I would probably choose the 12 over the 16 based on those kind of things I was just talking about.
Something interesting with intermittent fasting is that it's just funny to see how narratives change. So I remember, a little over a decade ago, people were talking about breakfast is so important. It's the most important meal of the day.
Yeah.
And now you're hearing the opposite, which is you should skip breakfast. Intermittent fasting has all these unique benefits, which seem to be refuted by the science. Yeah, I think when you equate calories, you don't see any. I don't think we have any evidence aside from those animal studies that you've mentioned, which is a correlation, not necessarily causation, showing that health outcomes and markers of health are improved by intermittent fasting over a calorie matched diet.
Yeah.
You mentioned carnivore. Carnivore is something that has gotten really popular recently, thanks to people like Paul Saladino, Jordan Peterson. But I think they don't talk much about the potential negative effects of the carnivore diet. And I think when you talk to dietitians, they're very concerned about the negative impacts this will have on health by propagating this message to such large audiences. Can you talk a little bit about why carnivore could negatively impact people's health?
So you even touched on one earlier that I'm not going to point to this as the main one, but I'm like, let's start with it. So fiber intake. You touched on it earlier, how it's like fiber intake is so consistently linked to positive health outcomes. Something that's really fascinating to me is if you just got a chart and you charted population-wide fiber intake and you charted risk of chronic diseases, it seems like as fiber gets higher, the risk of chronic disease gets lower. And it does that to quite a surprisingly high amount. It even makes me to a degree question like what should public health guidelines be for fiber? Like we have like my understanding is in Australia it's 25 grams for women and 30 grams for men. Sometimes I see people recommend 38 grams. Other people recommend 12 to 15 grams per 1,000 calories. But if we look at that chart, we're like, hang on, should we just go like even higher than those numbers? Um, and I could go deeper on that topic, but like let's just start with that. So fiber intake, that seems to be a common one. The next one is the main concern that I have is from a cholesterol perspective. So I am not somebody who is necessarily as concerned about cholesterol as some other people might be, but there is certain things here that I really want to talk about. One is you will see people point to individuals and be like, this person's been carnivore for 2 years and cholesterol hasn't been an issue for them. And I'm like, that is a complete misunderstanding of how cholesterol works. Like cholesterol, like if you have high cholesterol, it is incredibly likely that atherosclerosis is building up over time. That is not something that just develops over time. That's something that develops over a long period of time. There, even in just like there's discussion in the public health world about being like, should we be like going even lower cholesterol than we currently recommend? Like this is, and I don't want to get to like the statins debate, like this is part of why when people get put on statins, they do push it to what looks like extremely low levels, partly because it does offset the buildup of atherosclerosis and then the likelihood of cardiovascular disease. So I really want to touch on that about being like, you could look at somebody who's done it for 2 years and be like, oh, they're fine. And it's like, that's not a good argument. That like, we need really long sample size data on this. And I
Yeah.
personally wouldn't risk it myself about that data.
To give an analogy there, it's like saying so and so has been smoking for 2 years and they're absolutely fine. So
Mm,
smoking isn't bad for you. But when you track that data over a long enough time frame, you see
yeah.
that smoking does have very negative effects with health. And I think you see the same thing with high saturated fat intakes. And I assume that's what you're getting at when you mention cholesterol.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, atherosclerosis is the buildup of plaque in your arteries. Your arteries are how you transport blood around your body. And if they build up with plaque, they can't transport blood and nutrients to certain organs. So one of those is your heart. Heart disease is the largest killer of people in Australia and the USA. So it's probably a good idea to do things to mitigate your risk of heart disease. And to my knowledge, it's very well established that high saturated fat intakes are associated with an increased risk of heart disease.
Yeah. It's the most commonly linked thing. And I'm never one to like point to individuals and stuff like that, but there is one example I'm going to use here. Paul Saladino, in the peak of his like carnivore phase, shared his cholesterol data, and it was up there with like the highest I have quite literally ever seen. Like it was really, really high. And up until that moment, I had kind of been pointing out to most people, I don't worry so much about saturated fat. It's not, it's one of the lower priorities for this. Like being lean is a big factor that reduces cholesterol, being physically active, good fiber intake, so on and so forth. And that's all that I'm like, Paul's lean. He's in good shape. But like his cholesterol is super, super, super high. And it got me thinking a few things. Like one, clearly if you take this stuff to an extreme, even while being lean, like you will end up with really, really high cholesterol. And then two, you really have to have some conviction that you're right here, that you're willing to risk these abnormally high cholesterol levels that are so abnormal and so rare to believe that they don't necessarily matter when going back to the sample size thing. Like I quite literally say like that's the highest, or that's up there with the highest that I've seen. How do we have the sample size to be like, oh yeah, this is definitely safe for a long period of time. So even just from a cautious view, that's one of the angles I'd take. One other tiny cautious view thing that I'll chuck on there is from the kidney health perspective, being like, obviously I work in strength sports. Obviously I am more along the lines of encouraging relatively high protein intake. And if we look at the research on protein intake and kidney health, it seems like it's a non-issue when people have relatively high protein intakes. But there is also a line that it has not been checked above. There's the highest protein intake that's ever been studied is like 4.4 grams per kilogram, which is really, really, really high. And sometimes people cite that study and be like, "Oh, see, they didn't have issues," and I'm like, it was an 8-week study, and they didn't even measure kidney function. Like, just because we didn't see issues doesn't mean like there is above a certain line, and often with carnivore diets, you would be quite high for quite long. And I'm like, there is also a chance that even though I think protein's fine for kidneys, after a certain amount, maybe it's a risk as well.
That's often the case with science. Often we just don't have research at extremes to draw conclusions from. So like a good example is range of motion and muscle growth. So we know that so more range of motion, challenging muscles at length tends to be better for muscle growth. However, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean longer is always better. So like, for example, if I do a push-up or I do bench press and bring the bar to my chest, or do a push-up and bring my chest to the floor, I get a stretch on my pecs. That's, that's a significant range of motion. And I think that's probably great for maximizing muscle growth. It's definitely better than half reps, and that's been studied. But that doesn't mean I need to elevate my hands on parallettes and kind of go as deep
Yeah.
as I can and put myself in this compromising position, or use a cambered bar and get more stretch. It doesn't mean that more stretch is always better. And I think it's the same thing with protein intake and kidney function. It's like, sure, there's data to show that 2.2 grams is great, perhaps up to 3 grams is great, but we can't then make the jump and say that 10 grams is going to be absolutely fine.
Yeah, exactly right. Like, yeah.
Paul Saladino has, built a lot of fame. He's kind of condemned by the academic nutrition world, and a lot of his recommendations rely on mechanistic arguments. So, for example, tea is bad for you, or vegetables are bad for you because of defense chemicals. And the mechanism might exist. Plants might have defense chemicals that are bad if you're an insect, but it doesn't necessarily translate to humans. And when possible, I think it's always best to look at real world data. So it's easy to make a mechanistic argument for why intermittent fasting is great because of this hormone, or why low intensity cardio is better for fat loss because you burn more fat in the moment. But when you look at the real world data and you look at the actual outcomes, you see that's not the case. And I think when you look at these mechanisms about plants being bad for you, and you look at the real world data, they're definitely conflicting. It's almost like in every case, more plants is almost always a good thing. Would you agree with that?
I think so. And I really like that take just on like mechanisms. You can get lost in mechanisms through two angles. One, you could just misunderstand stuff and you can just get something wrong. That is something we see all the time. Two, you could be completely right, but the human body is very complex and there's a lot of things going on. And you've pointed to one thing out of hundreds of things. And that is why I go to outcomes so much heavily first, because it comes back to being like, well, how much does this mechanism matter if you've done this thing and then the outcome has been completely different? The low intensity cardio thing is a great example about being like, you can point to that first part of the mechanism and you're like, well, technically you're right. You are in this fat burning zone. You're burning more fat as a percentage of total calories. But if you just jump to the research showing that it doesn't really seem to matter, that's kind of all you need to do. And then you can also fill in the gaps and kind of explain why that doesn't matter. Like that would take me a while to explain, but I can go through that entire thing. But outcomes just matter so much more. One little thing that I will touch on is like sometimes people do take that to an extreme and they just completely ignore mechanisms. And it's like, it makes sense to focus on both. But if you had to pick one that matters more, obviously outcomes is what matters more.
Yeah, it's nice to have a mechanism to know why something works the way it does. But when your mechanism conflicts with real world data, we have to ask, why didn't we get the outcome we wanted? And often mechanisms don't work in a vacuum. Often
Yeah.
people place confidence in mechanisms that don't matter. So an example there is surface EMG readings. You can look at
Yeah.
surface EMG and say surface EMG is higher, therefore muscle growth is higher. But that's not true. Higher EMG readings does not mean more muscle growth. And mechanisms don't work in a vacuum. When you change one thing, other things change as well. So let's say you slow your reps down on the bench press and you can say, look, my time under tension increased, therefore it's great for muscle growth. Yeah, but you did much fewer reps and they seem to balance each other out and you should end up with similar growth. We've talked about diets and how there doesn't seem to be a best diet. There are some diets that are linked with positive health outcomes, like the Mediterranean diet. A lot of people put a lot of stock in certain foods. You should be eating this food, you should be eating that food. A popular term is superfood. Do you think there is such thing as a superfood?
So I'll rarely talk about superfoods just because I'm so big on variety and stuff like that. If I had to say something, I'd say, yes, I guess they are a thing. I'm going to use one example, and I don't think this is often pointed to as a superfood, but the example I'm going to use is tart cherries. So tart cherries are 5 times higher in antioxidants than regular cherries. Regular cherries are already high in antioxidants, but you can get some pretty cool things out of tart cherries by, when you juice things and it's easier to consume more of them. For example, like how many oranges does it take to like make a glass of orange juice? If you juice tart cherry juice and then you concentrate that juice, Like you can get to the point that's like the antioxidant equivalent of like 21 serves of fruits and vegetables is like a very popular claim out there. And then that has like pretty crazy benefits for like reducing muscle soreness. Like based on the research, on average, people end up 3 times less sore if you put them through a protocol that's designed to make them quite sore. They get like very consistently better sleep. There's a lot of positive outcomes there. And you're like, is that magic, or is it just the fact that such a high amount of antioxidants coming from foods? I would call that a superfood. Why do I not talk about superfoods that often though? I think it is just coming back to that whole big picture thinking about being like, if you do that greater than 80% coming from whole, minimally processed, nutrient-rich foods, one, you're probably likely to consume a bunch of common foods that are considered superfoods. And two, you're likely ticking a bunch of these boxes without even thinking about them.
Yeah, on that example of tart cherry juice or tart cherry concentrate, um, I would almost kind of opt for the other option of, consuming a lot of servings of a variety of fruits and vegetables, because you can look at one thing in isolation and say this is a superfood because it's, there's a lot of selenium in Brazil nuts, or there's a lot of
Yeah.
antioxidants in tart cherries. But as we spoke about earlier, you can't just look at one thing in a vacuum. There are so many things that contribute to a nutritious diet. And if you're just having some tart cherry juice, you might not be consuming enough fiber. Might not be consuming enough protein. You are likely not going to be consuming an array of micronutrients that you would get from eating a lot of different plant foods of different colors and a lot of variety.
Yeah, I also, and this is more speculation for me, I also think there's diminishing returns on just slamming the same thing over and over and over versus like, let's say that tart cherry juice has like all of the benefits I just kind of talked about. What if you had one food that was like that one day, and then the next day you had another food that had different benefits? And like, I would speculate with a high degree of confidence that if you did 7 different things over 7 different days, you're probably going to get more overall total benefit than if you just did the same one superfood every day for 7 days. That's my own speculation, though.
I agree. And this ties back to what's hot on social media versus what's truthful. Everybody should be eating tart cherries
Yeah.
versus, hey, you should eat a variety of plants and veggies, and it doesn't really matter which ones you eat. You can have asparagus or cabbage or broccoli, but just try to eat a wide variety. That wasn't, this one hack that's going to change my life,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Something I see a lot from kind of the conspiratorial crowd of the internet is that we shouldn't trust dietitians because there have been historical problems in food recommendations. Dietitians don't really use the food pyramid anymore. And historically, the advice has not aligned with what we know today. Why do you think historically nutrition advice has not been sound? And do you think this does discredit the nutrition industry?
Yeah, I'll answer both parts. I'm gonna jump in first with the criticism of dietitians in a way. There's not many things that like massively offend me. That one does massively offend me, and I'm kind of like, I think that comes from people who just don't know people in the industry. Like they generally don't know an actual dietitian or whatever. Because it's like it's so offensive because it's like you think I just went to university and just like was spoon fed stuff and did like no like I chose this as a career. I go deep on this. Just like you have studied to be a physio and you're talking about like stretch mediated hypertrophy and like all the research that's come out on that recently. It's not like you just like went through a course and just never learned anything new on your own. Like, I don't know, kind of silly. But let's talk about the like historical problems in nutrition science. There is a few things there that's like, okay, I do get that industry obviously will influence the research. Like, obviously, their goal is to make profits. Like, that's not a conspiracy. That's like that is just the truth, right? It is if they're funding stuff, why are they funding stuff? There's obviously a reason they're funding stuff. They're not just doing it because they're kind people doing it to try and make a profit. You could talk about publication bias because I'm not personally a researcher. I'm not the best person to kind of talk about this, but my understanding is that publication bias is a lot harder in 2024 than it probably was previously because I believe you have to register every study you're doing, which therefore means you can't just like register a bunch of studies and then when they show the findings that you don't want to show, you just pull them. But I do believe there is some like fudging of numbers that would go on occasionally. Like this would be a different topic, but like you would have seen way back that like hip thrust versus squat study and like the what was it? Squats outperformed hip thrust or something. I can't remember. And like the
Similar
number,
outcomes for glute growth.
yeah. And like when people analyze it, the numbers were just weird. Like firstly, there's a lot of like oddly round numbers. And then secondly, like the amount of weight people were squatting versus the amount that they were hip thrusting was just like
Oh,
questionable.
sorry, you're talking about the, yeah, I'm familiar. You're not talking about the most recent study that was,
No, not the most recent
the
one.
old
The
one. Yeah,
Barbeo
yeah,
et
the one
al.
that got
Like, yeah.
retracted. Sorry, my bad. Yeah.
Yeah. But like I'm using that one as an example of it being like, it just got me thinking, being like, I don't know what happened with that study, but I'm using example of thinking, what is to stop people from just like faking a few numbers here and there? Like what actually like genuinely is to stop that? So like even if publication bias is or isn't an issue in 2024, and we know historically it probably was more of an issue, if there's industry funding involved, like is there chances that studies are set up to be designed to be favorable for stuff? I'm going to use an unrelated example to the food pyramid, but like let's look at like amino acid kind of studies. If I was trying to sell branched chain amino acids, I would be far more likely to set up a study that gives people a suboptimal protein intake, because then you're more likely to benefit from higher quality protein than if people already had a good protein intake. And then two, I would contemplate the option of giving two groups a suboptimal protein intake and then adding amino acids on top of that. So it's like it's almost like having a better protein intake in general. And the odds of that coming out with a positive finding is so much higher than if you put together studies with good protein intake off the bat and you took away some of that protein and replaced it with branched chain amino acids. Like that's a little thing with study design that's like, well, obviously if there's money involved, I'd go down that route. This leads back to the food pyramid where people will criticize that grains traditionally were at the bottom, like whole grain carbohydrate sources. And you could point to that as a valid criticism. I'm going to take the other angle. And I say this through the lens of somebody who's not supporting of government guidelines or anything. Like, I don't even care about that topic. Like, taking the other angle, there's a lot of things in the guidelines that people just kind of ignore. For example, in Australia, less than 5% of people meet the fruit and vegetable recommended intake. That's a super low percentage. They also have very clear recommendations of limiting what they call discretionary foods or junk foods or whatever. In Australia, around 30 to 35% of our calorie intake comes from that category. It comes from the non-core food groups category. We just conveniently will ignore that. It doesn't recommend refined carbohydrate intake, but that is a decent percentage of the carbohydrate intake. And a lot of people criticize the guidelines by being like, oh, they told us to eat heaps of carbs. And I'm like, you can't really cherry pick that. You can't just ignore the fact that they told us to eat heaps of fruits and vegetables, but nobody did it, and then act as if the guidelines had this power to make us all consume heaps of carbohydrates. That's my own 2 cents on it. So like I see both sides of it being like, I do believe there is industry funding, all of those kind of things. But I also don't think the guidelines have this power that people think they do, because they're not influencing people to eat more fruits and vegetables. They're not influencing people to reduce the
Yeah.
intake of the things that they're telling people to reduce.
That's something I see a lot. People say, "Oh, well, obesity rates have increased over
There's
this
a chart
time
of
frame."
like the 1980s. It's like the US guidelines were introduced here, and you can literally see obesity kind of like starts to skyrocket there. What else changed though? There's so many things that
Exactly,
changed.
and in addition to that, nobody follows the guidelines. Like very few people follow
No.
the guidelines. So it's like I recently read a study about core strengthening for back pain, and in this study there wasn't a protective effect from core strengthening, but the core strengthening group didn't increase strength. So it kind of
Yeah.
kind of doesn't really answer that question. People like you are kind of the people that I think are really important in the industry, where I feel like you're genuinely interested in dietetics. You care about the truth, and you'll read these studies and say, what conclusion can we make from it? Has this been replicated? And you'll put more weight in that. So I think there are checks and balances in place as well. And another thing I think people don't talk about is just that our understanding of everything has increased so much in the last 50 years. So like 50 years ago, we didn't know what to eat. You know, go back. I'm not sure when the debate was, but I feel like it would have been around that time frame about whether smoking was actually bad for you. You know, that was
Yes,
a
it's
genuine
crazy, isn't
debate that
it?
took a long time to
Yeah.
get answered. And sure, the guidelines haven't been perfect historically, but I think they are getting better. And when nutrition is not my area of expertise, which is why I've got you on. But when I look at the exercise guidelines, I actually think they're pretty good. Like do some aerobic activity, do some resistance training. Like, yeah, that's, you know what, that kind of is in line with what the research says is good for health outcomes. I just wanted to track back a little bit to when we were talking about carnivore and cholesterol. A lot of people talk about cholesterol intake, versus saturated fat intake for increasing blood cholesterol. Do you have any insights on this topic? Is eating a lot of egg yolks going to be bad for me? Is it pretty is there a lot of variation there? And what do we know about saturated fat versus cholesterol intake?
Yeah, so there's two extremes to the argument. One extreme over here is that, I'll start over here. One extreme over here is that dietary intake of cholesterol increases blood cholesterol. We need to avoid it. The other one over here is we don't care about dietary cholesterol. We care about blood cholesterol. They're different things. Most of the cholesterol in our blood is synthesized in our own body. My interest in nutrition started with bodybuilding.com. It actually, unfortunately, just shut down. Not that I've been on in many, many years, but there were some very smart people on there and some very dumb people, but there were some very smart people. And one of the things that I learned on there was that this side of the argument is far more correct than this side of the argument in terms of we don't really care about dietary cholesterol that much. And I came into the nutrition world kind of with that view being my main thing, almost to the extent that I'm like, it really doesn't matter in comparison to pretty much all of these other things. I've slowly shifted a tiny, tiny bit more towards the center in terms of my current consensus is that the average person, around 20% of their blood cholesterol is from dietary cholesterol, and the rest is synthesized in our own body, which is partly stimulated by things like saturated fat intake and other stuff that matter clearly far more than dietary cholesterol intake. Which therefore tells me that most people probably do not need to focus on that. Even if I'm working with somebody with high cholesterol, I'm not really focusing on eggs that much or higher dietary cholesterol foods. But where it gets interesting is at extremes. Example, if somebody had a normal dietary cholesterol intake, and then they went completely plant-based and had no dietary cholesterol, and let's pretend they kept every other variable the same, like their macronutrient intake remains the same, their calories remain the same, their exercise, all those things. You would expect their cholesterol to drop a little bit because of that, say, 20% that was once there is now going missing. And that's not to say that your body wouldn't synthesize some to create like to make up the gap or whatever, but you would expect a drop. And that is also what we do see in the research. But the other extreme is interesting, where it's like, well, what if somebody was having 6+ eggs per day, which you would see in the bodybuilding world as well? And is it now more than 20% of their blood cholesterol? And I'm using a round figure of 20%. It's not exactly that, but the point I'm getting to is it's like, it doesn't seem to matter that much. But if you go to extremes, then it's like, well, it probably does matter a little bit as well.
Right. When you were talking about the concern with cholesterol in the carnivore diet, were you referring to the high saturated fats that are associated with eating?
More so, yeah.
Right.
I think far more with the high saturated fat, but it's also the fact that when you go so extreme with that, your dietary cholesterol intake will actually get quite high as well. So it's like, I'm more concerned about the saturated fat, but that actually is one of the outlier cases of like, oh, actually, maybe dietary cholesterol does actually matter in that circumstance as well.
Yeah, and on that note, I know that high blood pressure is a risk factor for heart disease, and I certainly know that when I eat meat, I like to put salt on it. And I think that's another risk with carnivore diets is this kind of high sodium. Just to finish off, do you have any actionable tips for the general population to improve their diet? So things like try to eat 30 plant foods throughout the week. Try to get more colors on your plate. Try to cut the fat off meats and eat leaner proteins when possible. Do you have anything that you think could improve my diet and those listening?
Yeah, so I do think of all of those things. I do think that greater than 80% of stuff coming from nutrient-rich foods, I think that makes sense. The final layer, I don't know if this is relevant for you, but I do think this is very relevant at a population level, is not being a black and white thinker, seeing nuance. We see this being so important in nutrition from so many angles. Even if you look just at the statistical data on people who maintain weight loss if they lose a significant amount of weight, one of the major common themes is they aren't black and white thinkers. They see shades of gray. A lot of people who struggle with maintaining weight loss, black and white thinkers. They might do a dietary approach, let's say low carb, and they're either on that or they're not on that. Somebody who sees shades of gray could potentially have a random high carb day for whatever reason and just be okay with it and just go back to it. And each their own. People can live their life in however way they want. But I also think this extends to like when you go on holiday. If one person's a black and white thinker and they go on holiday, they might think, I will not train at all while I'm on holiday. I will not choose any health conscious like dietary choices. I will only eat the thing that I want to eat the most every single meal. And I know I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but somebody who is a nuanced thinker could be like, yeah, a lot of the time I'll train less. I will make certain choices just because I want to have the food. It has nothing to do with nutrition. And then there'll be some of the time where I'll just make health conscious choices as well. And I'll still have an incredible holiday and it'll just be a little bit better for my overall health. So I think seeing shades of grey is a huge thing.
Yeah, I think that's really important in most aspects of life. Like that saying, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I think you see that in so many things in life, in exercise as well. It's like, if you go on holiday, I'm not going to be able to train. I'm on vacation. A lot of people are all or nothing. Like, I'm either following this strict schedule or I'm doing nothing. And often just doing a little bit is so helpful. Like, you can maintain your strength gains with like a ninth of what you normally do for a young, healthy adult. So it's like just throwing a few sets in when you can be really beneficial, but a lot of people don't like to think like that. And it brings me back to when we were talking about diets earlier and how do these diets work, keto, carnivore, vegan, and it ultimately comes back to simple principles. It's like they all create a calorie deficit, which results in weight loss. Have you heard of Occam's razor?
Fill me in. Yeah.
So when it's like the simplest explanation is generally the best one, you know, and people do all this mental gymnastics with mechanisms and this and that, and it changes this hormone and it does that and insulin this, and it's like they all just create a deficit. You know, that's the simple explanation. That's probably how it works. I think a lot of people would have a better understanding of nutrition if they took a lot more of a simplistic approach and a lot more of a flexible approach. So I'm glad that you said that. To finish off, I just want to let people know where they can find you. I have some education in nutrition, but I'm certainly not an expert. So if somebody wants to see you for their goals with weight loss, general health, any nutrition advice, where can they find you? How can they book in with you? And where can they read more or see more of your content?
Yeah, so I'll point to 3 places. The first one is if somebody wanted to book in, so just the website, www.idealnutrition.com.au. And if somebody just wanted content, I've got 2 places. One is the Ideal Nutrition podcast. You can just search that in, that will come up. Or Instagram. So I post 5 times a week on Instagram. So that's Aidan, the dietitian, with underscores in between.
Perfect. Awesome. It's been very insightful. So thanks for your time.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me.